Rags by Patricia Scarry. Illustrated by Barbara Lanza. Mr. Calibanny the grocer liked dogs. He wanted one for a pet, but his wife was not fond of dogs. One morning, Mr. Smelt, who sold fish across the street, ran out of his store shouting, "Help! I've been robbed!" "It wouldn't have happened if you'd kept a watchdog," said Mrs. Smelt. "Well, that won't happen to us," said Mr. Calibanny the grocer. "I'm going to the pet shop right now to get a big, fierce watchdog." "You know I don't like dogs," Mrs. Calibanny said with a sigh. "I want the biggest, fiercest dog you've got," Mr. Calibanny told the man at the pet shop. "Here's a puppy who will grow up to be the biggest, fiercest dog you've ever seen," said the man. He handed Mr. Calibanny a small, furry bundle to take home in his pocket. "So this is the big, fierce watchdog?" said Mrs. Calibanny, laughing. "He looks like a bundle of rags." And from then on, they called the dog Rags. Mrs. Calibanny made the puppy a nice warm meal. Then she sewed him a little rag doll and stuffed it with dried beans. The puppy took it in his teeth and shook it. He really liked that doll. The first night in the store, the little watchdog was afraid of the dark. He cried and cried. "Hush, Rags, you can come into bed with us," said Mr. Calibanny, "and bring your dolly." Rags grew fast. He ate and grew and grew. When the beanbag wasn't in Rags' teeth, he made sure it was close to his paw. If the doll disappeared for even a moment, Rags would howl and howl. Some watchdog," sniffed Mrs. Calibanny. Rags grew so big that a wag of his tail would knock down a tower of soup cans. He loved everybody. "Now that he's so big, when is he going to start being fierce?" asked Mrs. Calibanny. "Oh, pretty soon," her husband promised. "He'll toughen up when he runs around with other dogs," said Mrs. Calibanny. But Rags ran away from the first dog he saw. Rags ran away from cats, too, even inside his own store. He ran away from mice and spiders and even Mrs. Calibanny's broom. In fact, Rags felt safer off the floor. He would jump up on the counter with his beanbag doll and curl up beside the cash register. "Look, Rags is guarding the money like a real watchdog," said Mr. Calibanny proudly. Rags spent most of his time there. "Oh well," said Mrs. Calibanny, "at least he isn't underfoot." One evening, while Mrs. Calibanny sat counting up the money they had made that day, Rags jumped up onto the counter and knocked over all the neat piles of dollars and coins. Money flew everywhere. Mr. and Mrs. Calibanny scrambled about, trying to get all the money back together. Rags tried his best to help too, but when all the money was put away, they discovered that $7 was missing. Mrs. Calibanny was very angry. "Now he's losing the very money he's supposed to guard. He goes to the pound in the morning," she cried. "Rags, you're not a good watchdog, but I'm sure going to miss you," said Mr. Calibanny sadly. Rags sniffled a bit. Then he took his beanbag doll to the cash register and fell asleep. The grocer went out the back door to empty the garbage. Out there, in the night, a robber was waiting. He nipped in the door as soon as Mr. Calibanny turned his back. He tiptoed over to the cash register to steal the money. He wasn't afraid of Rags, who was fast asleep. He'd heard all about Rags. But when the robber tossed the beanbag doll on the floor, Rags woke up, and Rags was furious. He leapt at the robber and knocked him down. Then he sat on him and barked. Mr. Calibanny heard Rags barking and ran into the store. He saw the robber and shouted, "Help! Police!" When Officer Duffy ran into the store, Rags was still sitting on top of the robber, his beanbag in his mouth. Rags was a hero. His picture appeared in the newspaper. "I told you he'd grow into a big, fierce watchdog," said Mr. Calibanny proudly. Rags wagged his tail happily and shook his beanbag doll. "And he did," agreed Mrs. Calibanny, smiling at Rags.